My scale weight continues to fluctuate. Is this normal? How do I reduce these massive drops and spikes? Okay, so one thing I want to commend you on is like even asking the question, like you notice like the spikes the spikes up and the drops are equally problematic. So this is why I like to take 7 days of scale weight essentially to average out. Because even for the individual, let's say who's like carb cycling, who's not being at it, like just very on top of their sodium intake, maybe one day you don't get a lot of sleep, maybe the next day you get a ton. It's not uncommon to see anywhere from like a 3 to maybe even 4 or 5 pound fluctuation, especially if we're talking about a single week out of the month, maybe where you're ovulating or you're about to get your period. But I find that having the average as well as the range, the high and the low, I find that to be really helpful because ultimately that builds this picture around what we can generally expect with your current food reporting, with your current consistency. Now, we really have to discern, like, are these fluctuations due to essentially like aspects of your program that are within your control to modify? So if we're talking about digestion, like this is something for the longest time I struggled with, where I would only go to the bathroom like 3 or 4 times a week. It would be very consistent with missing an entire day. Well, we know that's not good for you. We know that that's not normal. And especially if you're talking about like in a build where food's a little bit higher, stress is lower, this shouldn't be the standard. So if you're finding that like those high weigh-ins, like good on you for still taking your scale weight, even on days you don't use the restroom, if that's the case. But if we're finding that to be a repeated pattern that we can directly tie to like, this happens every time you don't use the bathroom, or like this happens every time you get a poor night's sleep, the idea is really like we should reduce any catalyst to what's causing that inflation. So I'll tell you a story. I had a client who was in contest prep, very big into like gut health, functional health, has done some like coursework herself with better educating like what she needs in terms of like managing overall like gut microbiome. We're in prep and her calories are pretty low and she ended up getting sick. Now, I trust her and like I know that she understands macros because she's been tracking them for fucking forever. She made some adjustments that week while she was sick, which the understanding was, hey, I don't want you to train. I don't want you to do cardio. I really would just like you to rest. Don't even worry about getting steps in. Like the focus is getting you back to 100%. So within that, I was like, okay, cool. We're going to lower her food a little bit. But because her activity is lower and because like we're doing things to support just like overall like recovery and immune function, like this, I anticipate that she's going to come back from this week on track. Like we shouldn't necessarily miss a beat. Well, this week, knowing her, like she was like, okay, I'm going to do everything I can on like the functional side, the micronutrient side. And she plugged in a lot of foods, a lot of fermented foods, a lot of probiotics and bone broth. Now, the sources of foods that she was using were very high in sodium. And that was the thing. I was like, okay, these things technically might offer some support in some ways, but when she came back the following week, her average was up like 3 pounds. And it really was very clear looking at her pictures. It's like, okay, like your sodium intake had to have gone up because you're holding so much water despite technically reporting feeling better and no longer being sick. And what we found was like, I went to her log and I'm like, okay, well, you had soup pretty much for all your meals, like 2 back-to-back days. And then pretty much every other meal after that, the remainder of the week, she was adding in probiotics, like the sauerkraut and the kimchi to all of her meals in pretty large portions. And even though they're low calorie, she's like, yeah, these will be really good to make sure I don't get backed up. While I'm taking medication, while I'm not moving as much, while I feel run down. But the thing was for each like very small, like 30-gram serving of these probiotics and these fermented foods, I was like, you probably increased your sodium intake to somewhere between 5 to 8 grams, just not even realizing it. So what I told her is I was like, listen, like we didn't necessarily get the data I was hoping for, but because we saw weight come on very quickly throughout the week and we can pretty much link it, like this has never happened before. And it's reflected across your entire system. It's not just your lower gut. It's not just your legs. This is something that I can reasonably assume if we go back to your normal sodium intake and increase fluid from here, it should come off seemingly quickly, which ultimately, that's what happened. She went back to her normal sodium intake that was between 2 and 3 grams, made sure that moving forward that she was accounting for those additional foods and their sodium content. But I mean, the water came off seemingly overnight. And it was something I had to explain. I'm like, hey, in the off season, like these things don't really matter, but specifically in prep, I need to see those fluctuations, and we need to know those fluctuations have a reason behind them. Because if they don't, that is a little inconclusive, and then it's something that we need to further investigate. And if there's not an obvious reason as to why these massive jumps are happening, it could potentially put you back depending on what the actual culprit is. I think the other thing that we need to be aware of is the consistency in food tracking. So the same thing happened with an individual who was using soup for like multiple meals, but it was very sporadic. So, I mean, like I love like Asian cuisine. Like I really love this like store-bought mix of like tonka paste. But I kid you not, to use the full amount that I want to use, I mean, like I literally would be increasing my sodium intake by several grams just through that one meal. So I think consistency in the types of foods we're having specific to sodium, but then also the weight. So that's something that like when I moved into a fat loss phase, I went from eating noodles like momofuku noodles back to potatoes. So the carb content was about 50% of what the noodles were, and they had higher volume. They were higher up on the satiety. They are higher up on the satiety index. So just overnight, I mean, like I was able to, yes, reduce calories, but what I didn't account for is the increase in GI weight. So that was the other thing that I've seen with clients before. They will go from eating very high calorie, low volume foods. And then when we go into a fat loss phase, the immediate switch is then I'm going to load up on vegetables. I'm going to do the big salad bowls. I'm going to create a lot of volume off little calories. Now, what we have to remember is that that is going to sit in your gut for a period of time. And if that's something that you already struggle with, like regularity, that can be something that then does cause these skews in scale weight. So this isn't something that I like enjoy micromanaging specifically for non-contest prep clients, but if it's something that is causing a problem in your ability to use the restroom, or if it's something that's even like just causing a problem in us getting the information that we need to get because of, you know, these artificial spikes, if we can't trace it back to either food or inflammation because of an output, so either cardio or training, then from there, we really have to do this kind of elimination. I don't even know if I want to call it elimination. We really have to play detective in the fact that like there is an explainable reason to why this is happening. And if we can deduce what the potential culprits are, that might be easiest by eliminating the potential aspects that would skew that daily scale weight. So for me, this might even look like asking the client like, hey, you don't have to follow like a strict meal plan, but for the next week, if this is like a persistent issue, can you eat roughly the same foods and make sure you're really on top of hydration, sleep, sodium, and you're not having these like crazy days where you go get like 10,000 more steps than what you normally would.